Ed is a parishioner. He's a retired professor of pastoral theology and spirituality at St. Catherine University, where he taught undergraduate and graduate courses for 35 years. He's a graduate of University of Notre Dame and the author of many articles and books. One of his most recent is featured tonight here, and it's on pilgrimage, exploring a great spiritual practice. He's a spiritual guide trained at the Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, and has also organized and led groups of pilgrims to numerous holy sites, taught courses and facilitated retreats on the topic, and traveled to South America, Europe, Asia, and the United States in search of wisdom. And so we welcome Ed tonight, and I want you to know that there is a handout Ed has provided, and if you people in Facebook land would like one, feel free to contact me either by email or call the office. The office number is 651-227-7669, or you can email me at carend@morecommunity.org, and I can mail you one, email you one, or you can pick one up. So just wanted to know that's available. And with that, I will introduce you, or I will have Ed step in. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. It's good to see you, Carol, Mike, Phil. Is it Phil? We got a large crowd here. Actually, when we talked about a time for the workshop, we thought early June. It'll be mild weather, just a beautiful time of year. Well, who knew it'd be the 10 worst, highest temperatures that Minnesota has had, as I understand it. But anyway, if you can't make it, which you didn't, many of you, just know that I'm going to speak about the whole area of pilgrimage, but also give you some questions that you might consider writing down and maybe coming back to later. When I give my workshops, I always like the interaction with people and some discussion and all, but we are a bit limited tonight. Anyway, it's good to be here. I love this parish. I've been here 4 years now. I was here years ago. I was married here, and my 2 sons were baptized here. And then we went elsewhere and lost our way. And now I'm back. I'm very happy to be here in this parish. As I've told many people, it feeds my soul. This whole topic of pilgrimage, though, is something that's interested me for years because I like to travel as part of my Irish roots, I think. They were known for their desire and their actual pilgrimage sites they would visit all over Europe. And then eventually, of course, a lot of those Irish came to the United States, and that practice continued. But it's in my bones, I think. Also, I was born in Minneapolis, which was the good part. And then I was taken against my will to North Dakota as a child, and I spent much of my youth trying to get back to Minnesota. But I think it was in a series of small towns that I had so much time on my hands that I wanted to read about this wider world. And that's really what got me started, I think, in wanting to travel. When I met my wife, Joanne, she wanted to travel. So we were very happy to be going at various places. I want you to think about this pilgrimage idea in terms of your own lives. Pilgrimages perhaps you've gone on, perhaps sightseeing you've done that turned into a pilgrimage. I'd like to talk about that a bit. But the one quote I have is from Vincent van Gogh, the painter. "We are pilgrims on the earth and strangers. We have come from afar and we are going far." Vincent van Gogh is one of those figures in my life that has meant a great deal to me in terms of his artwork. Even though my mother said at one point, I have a large framed print of one of his paintings. And my mother says, "Oh, I could do that." And I said, "I don't think so. I just don't think so." But he was one of these figures that my son John actually got me interested in. And I started going to the various sites that he lived and painted. And I was working on a book in which a key chapter was on Vincent and Theo, the two brothers, and the contribution each made to the other. But as a result of the travel I did, I also ended up in Amsterdam at the Vincent van Gogh Museum. And that's where, how it's set up is you start from his earliest paintings, and there's the progression across to his last, what's considered his last painting. And the earlier paintings I'm not that drawn to. It's Rembrandt. He was trying to imitate Rembrandt with the dark colors, and it's dark. And then suddenly you start to see, as you progress in the museum, the much brighter colors, the much more vibrant colors. That's when Theo, his brother, had introduced Vincent to the Impressionists in Paris, in which Vincent then began to incorporate that color into his work. What I find significant, though, is his last painting, at least the last one that we know of, is Crows Over Wheatfield. And there's this scene of a wheat field with these dark crows flying, and in the distance, the dark clouds. But the wheat field is in harvest. It's a bright golden color. It's really a combination, as I see it, of both the dark and the light, which is much what our own lives are like, I think. We have to, as part of the human journey, encounter both the darkness and the light. And hopefully the light itself will dominate as our life unfolds. But it was Vincent who says that we're pilgrims. We're all pilgrims. It was the first, when he was studying to be a minister, it was the first sermon he preached on, was the whole concept of pilgrimage itself. Life is a journey, a voyage of discovery, a pilgrimage. Each year, 2 million, well, at least before the pandemic, and I think it's going to come back again, is in the process, actually, of return. But each year, 2 million Muslims are pilgrims to Mecca. It's part of their religion that if they can at all afford to go to Mecca, they are obligated to do so. This is one of their tenets of faith. There's the pilgrims of our own Catholic faith. The pilgrims, 5 million that go to Lourdes in France, where Bernadette, the peasant girl, encountered the lady that spoke to her. I had the privilege of going there with a group of pilgrims, and I was so moved by that experience to see these waters and the church and all that. There's also Our Lady of Guadalupe outside of Mexico. And Joanna and I went there for the first time. And I tell people that as we approached the shrine where Mary appeared, I felt the ground as having energy and power. And it was not something that I was expecting. But it was like this energy was there. I learned later that this was also a holy site before Mary and the Catholics came along, and that it was associated with the divine feminine. Power, energy. Our Lady of Fatima, I was also, as part of this Marian pilgrimage I went on a few years ago, and that was, again, the processions around at night, etc. This is where these 3 peasant children experienced the sun, on one of the last appearances of Mary, the sun twirling in the sky. And I mean, it was an amazing sight for everyone. Well, I didn't see the sun twirling, but by God, you have to believe me this, after our procession at night, I saw the moon. The church, the old church, was up there on the hill, and I saw this moon move across the sky. Now, tell me I was hallucinating, but it was something of an experience to have had. Millions bathe in the Ganges River in India, which is sacred for Buddhists and Hindus. Millions go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Thousands even go to Graceland and see Elvis Presley's home. So there's all sorts of different pilgrimages one can make. As I say, the great religions expect us to do this as a spiritual aid in our own spirituality. But there's also this, these other sites that we wouldn't necessarily call them religious, but they still have a dynamic to them of the sacred. I remember taking my sons to Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois. And that was, this my great respect for Lincoln. And to go there and to see this tomb with my sons was a great experience. I was introducing them to the history and the contribution of Lincoln himself. There was also the pilgrimage I made with my mother after my father died. I asked her if she'd like to go on a road trip to southern Minnesota, where my Irish and German ancestors are buried. And she did, and we had 5 days of travel. We went to the cemeteries. One town, tiny town in southern Minnesota, was founded by some of our Irish ancestors. But it's also the fact that I heard stories from my mother that I'd never heard before about ancestors I didn't know much about. One of them was my great-grandfather, Michael Foy, and how he, when I was a small child, he was crippled. He was staying with my grandparents, Michael was, but he was crippled. He couldn't move much, but he was also always very attentive to, if I fell over as a child, he would let people know. Michael Foy, I never knew that about him. But as I say, some of these trips really are pilgrimages, encounters with our ancestors and our deeper selves, I think. I too am a pilgrim. I've had this opportunity as part of my teaching and my writing to travel to Europe, to South America, to Asia, because of my long-suffering wife, who was home taking care of the kids and also had a full career herself. But it was her great generosity that allowed me to do these things. Years ago, I was in Locronan, Brittany. It's a Celtic part of France. It was founded by the Celts, and it's still very Celtic. And I was taken by a monk, who was my guide, to this village, medieval village, Locronan. It's still, kind of the roads are cut off, and it is like going back into time. And going into a village that is as it was then. But we went into this one shop, and there was a wood carver there, and I was drawn to what he was carving. And this is a figure that he was just finishing painting after carving it. It's St. James, and it's the epitome of the pilgrim. Santiago de Compostela, if you've heard that pilgrimage site, it's in, again, northwestern Spain, very Celtic too. But he is the figure, Santiago de Compostela, he's the figure of the typical pilgrim in the Middle Ages. He's given a cap that he wears and a shell that's on the top of his cap. This was a symbol of pilgrimage. If you went to these different pilgrimage places in the Middle Ages, you brought back tokens of a remembrance of these places. And this cockle shell was something that's associated with that place in Spain, of St. James. He's carrying a walking stick, which, let me assure you, pilgrims needed in those days. They didn't have the cars or even the bikes to go on. He's carrying a paunch for his food, I presume, and his essentials. I'm not sure. He had a toothbrush, but he carried something in that. And then the Bible in the other hand. And that was something that pilgrims were expected to bring with them on their journey. But he represents for me the pilgrim, kind of the epitome of a pilgrim. The pilgrim that lies within us all. I think we're all pilgrims. We're all called to be pilgrims. And our own Catholic faith is very much associated with pilgrimage. We go back to the earliest, what's considered the earliest pilgrims in the Christian story were the wise men, who came from afar and were led by the star to Jesus' birthplace to give him honor. And the star is another symbol of pilgrimage. There's so many writings that are associated with stars, but this is definitely the story of the wise men. And Jesus, he was raised, the Jewish family he was raised in, they were always once a year going to Jerusalem to, again, honor their ancestors in that whole ritual practices. After Jesus' death and resurrection, the followers went on pilgrimage back to Galilee, only to discover that he was very much alive for them. So we have the earliest stories of pilgrims, and then those that followed over the centuries. There were the Celtic peoples, as I mentioned, who were travelers, and they loved to travel. There were the old and ancient desert Christians, the mothers and fathers of the desert, who would traverse into the desert to the places perhaps associated with Jesus, but also with the monasteries that were rising, that were honoring Christianity. There were the Russian pilgrims, Russian Orthodox pilgrims. Throughout our history, our Christian history, there's a great deal of stories about pilgrimage and pilgrims. The term pilgrim is derived from the Latin peregrinus, which is per, through, ager, fields. Someone who leaves the familiar, the home, the places that are associated with familiarity, to go into sometimes a distant place. It was also, some of these early pilgrims, it was not easy as, many of us have had. They were often robbed, beaten, killed. Being a pilgrim was not an easy thing to do. And yet, the community really, families and community, if you were going on a pilgrimage, they had a mass for you, they prayed with you, they gave you the cockle shell or the walking stick, and you were sent forth representing them. Well, it was your journey, what you were learned, and if you were graced enough to return safely, was for them, something to be shared with the community that stayed home. St. Augustine in the City of God, his book says, life is a pilgrimage. We travel with a spiritual intent, associated perhaps with our longing for beauty or meaning or spirituality. It's a spiritual sort of draw. Now, I don't pretend to suggest that, well, I went on pilgrimage, as I say, a Marian pilgrimage with other pilgrims. That was certainly described as a pilgrimage. But I want you to think about sometimes we take a trip and it becomes a pilgrimage. We encounter something that we weren't expecting to encounter that really changes us. It's like an awakening, something we see for the first time. And then, even though we might have started as sightseers, looking for a good bargain or to see something different, it can become a pilgrimage. Tourism, we want to relax, vacation, enjoy, buy. I had this one group I took over to Europe with another person, and she had a different focus than I did, I think, in that she really wanted to have plenty of time to buy stuff for the people on the trip, which is fine, but it can be expensive, and it's not exactly what I planned when I was putting together the pilgrimage. But again, it's not to say that tourists don't become pilgrims too. Ann Tyler's The Accidental Tourist. I don't know if any of you know that novel anymore. It's old. It was made into a great movie. But it's a story about a travel writer telling people how to avoid change or being affected. In other words, his advice was, when you're going to another country, stay as American as you can. You don't want to be affected by all this other stuff. Well, pilgrimage is the exact opposite. You do want to be affected. Pilgrims travel as a sacred journey, a spiritual quest. Now, for yourselves, I have two questions that you might consider as we proceed with this workshop. The first one is, have you ever gone on pilgrimage? If so, where? Third question is, what were you seeking? And what did you find? Questions. Have you ever gone on pilgrimage? Where? What were you seeking? What did you find? As I mentioned, often what happens comes as a surprise. And if you're attentive to that experience, it's important to acknowledge that. There's a lot of, I'll get into this whole concept of synchronicity. Carl Jung talks about synchronicity as events come together in unexplained ways for our good. Now, Christians have a name for that. It's called grace. Things come together for us in unexpected ways. And if we pay attention, we can acknowledge that and be grateful. I told my students many times, when synchronicity happens, where something out of the ordinary strikes you as, well, that's interesting. That's the point to spend some time. Don't just, throw it away. Now, there's this handout that Carol mentioned that if any of you are interested, you can pick up via email or right here in the church, side entrance, or the office, So this is what I have on there. It's Stages of Pilgrimage. T.S. Eliot poet, English poet, writes, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." This is one of those, it's a common theme in many stories and myths. Joseph Campbell talks about this. It's as if in order to appreciate where we are, we have to leave home. And then when we come back, it's as if we see home for the first time. That's the revelations, the awakenings that can happen on pilgrimage. But these stages that I would suggest are, first of all, it's called to adventure. An invitation to leave home, the familiar. I had that invitation from a former student of mine who was teaching in Hawaii, and I was teaching him in San Francisco. He invited me and my family to visit Hawaii while he was away. It was going to be at Christmas time. And I said to him, because I associated Hawaii then, God knows I've changed, but I associated Hawaii then with commercialism, tourism, money, expenses. He said, no, there's a lot more. There's a spirituality. There's the ancient Hawaiian people have a richness there. They have a lot to do with the Celtic people, the appreciation of nature, women's leadership, all sorts of things. And I said, well, I really have enough. I was writing then on Celtic spirituality. I said, I really have enough to go on with that. But I'll ask Joanne. And I asked Joanne if she wanted to go. And she said, well, yeah, if we don't have to pay for it, once we get there, we don't have to pay for a place. I said, that's right, we can stay at John's place. And can we take the boys? I said, of course, yes. And my mother? I said, yes. So we went, and it was this invitation to explore the unknown for me, and what I found, as many people do who go to Hawaii, was a beautiful, beautiful islands, very friendly people, richness in myth and stories. I loved it. We came back from that experience in Hawaii at Christmas. We stayed until New Year. We came back and I said, okay, Joanne, I want to move to Hawaii. She said, well, it's to think about that. You know how much it costs, and what would you do for a living, and what would I do? I said, I don't know, but I want to go. Well, I'm still here. I said, okay, as a compromise, I want a fountain in our yard to remind me of the beauty of Hawaii and its water. So we have that, and love it. Not quite the same as Hawaii, though. But then I went back seven times after that. I taught in a school for a while over there. I took my son over, my mother over, because my mother had been left out. Joanne's mother had gone, and of course my mother didn't appreciate that. So anyway, it was this invitation to leave the familiar that I'm eternally grateful. And that's how sometimes an invitation comes, unexpectedly, from somewhere out of the blue. And yet, it may be something we should take seriously in considering a move, a pilgrimage. The second stage of pilgrimage is the road of trials. This is the pilgrimage road. We could go on an adventure, but adventures, being part of the human journey, are often filled with difficulties. Have you ever taken a group of people, as I have, over to a different place in Europe, for example, it's, it's interesting how people interact. The first few days are good. But after that, then there's some, no matter how many times you tell them we have to leave at a certain time. No, not really. There's this one couple that I knew. I liked them, but they were always late. And there's one of the last journeys in Ireland it was. I said, okay, there's the Germans. The Germans have these buses. They're always in competition. We have to beat the Germans at this holy place of Glendalough. I told this to them, and, well, guess who didn't show up? This couple that's always was late. And by God, I was behind the driver. Come on, we've got to beat the Germans. We've got to beat the Germans. And by God, we did, but no help from the couple that were always late. But these things happen. Different things that we don't realize take place. But if you've been with families on a trip before, you know how difficult it can be at times, just coordinating everybody's travel and moods and interrelationships. One of the things, though, on this road of trials is that we encounter helpers, unexpected helpers along the way. This is part of the synchronicity, I think, of travel, that we often encounter when we most need somebody, a person who comes along and is there. I mean, I've had experiences in different places where I'm lost, really, really lost. And it's probably the look in my face, but people come up and say, "Can I help you?" And they often lead me or give me directions to precisely the place I need to go. Kay Vandervoort, who's a friend of mine in Manresa, where Ignatius Loyola spent time. I think that's where he also wrote his exercises. But she said that they were lost, this group of Americans in Manresa, and a person came out of the blue and directed them to where to find or how to find this place. And she said, "You're like an angel." And he said, "An archangel, really, but good luck with the rest of your travels." So that's often the experience of being led. I was in Barcelona at Sagrada Familia Church that Gaudi, who's now being considered for sainthood, by the way, that he had built, or he had started building. God knows it's been 100 years and it's still going on. But I asked this friend of mine, "Where is Gaudi buried?" And he said, "I don't know." And then just ahead of us was the sign, Gaudi's grave is in the crypt. There it was. I mean, the question posed itself, and then the answer came almost immediately. This is the grace that can happen on pilgrimage. The third stage is return home. As I mentioned, pilgrimage is about community. Fellow pilgrims on the journey, and those left behind. It's just important to keep this in mind. It's not just us who have the privilege and the wonder of going on pilgrimage. It's the people that are left behind that we should be sharing our stories with. First of all, when I was taking groups over there, we would come back. Everybody was taking pictures and everything. But we wait a month or two, and then we all gather for a dinner, and then we could share our experiences among ourselves, what we remembered, what was important. And that was very worthwhile, to put the whole travel in perspective. But at the same time, it's what we brought back to our families and could share with them. Well, if they're interested. Depends on the age of your children, etc. But it was certainly something that is a wonder to behold when we've experienced the wonder. So that sharing gives us a sense of sharing what we know, what we've acquired that's meant to be shared. Treasures already there at home. The sense of seeing the ordinary in a new way. Some common elements, these again are from years of experience in my own travels, but also with others in my reading that I did. Some common elements that you find is the first one is identifying our longing, our hunger, our desire to visit certain places. This is what it's important to see desire as a positive thing. Sometimes in Christianity, desire is considered suspect. But pay attention to our desires. They often can lead us to new awarenesses and new travel. Carefully observe the way your heart draws you, and then choose that way with all your strength. That's a Jewish Hasidic prayer. Consider where you're being led. So for you listeners, if you're still there, think about places that there is a draw, a curiosity. I found that some of my most wonderful experiences of pilgrimage came from a picture I'd seen, or a series of pictures that opened up another part of the world to me. I saw pictures of Buddhists in Myanmar, the country now being decimated by the generals again. But there's these beautiful Buddhas, and I'd never heard of Myanmar. Of course, it's Burma. But because of those pictures, I wanted to go there and did. Carefully observe the way your heart draws you. Second one is the sense of timing, the inner clock, the Kairos time. St. Paul writes about it. Now is the acceptable time. This is the day of salvation. Now may be the time where we should go on pilgrimage. Despite some of the difficulties we foresee, we can't be ignorant about those, but again, what is drawing us? How strong is that draw? Sense of when can we do it? I encourage journaling about this. Places that you want to visit. Write about it. Why? What's the draw for you? And what's the timing? Black Elk, who's also being considered in the Catholic Church as a saint. Black Elk had these visions early in his life. And then he put them aside. He didn't act on them. But then suddenly, as he grew into adolescence, he said, even the birds were saying, it is time, it is time. And he went to the wise man and decided that his vision needed to be enacted for the sake of the tribe. But it is time meant it was now time, or else he became more sick by ignoring the vision or the timing. Hildegard of Bingen, the great German mystic, was the same way. She got sick when she ignored the visions that were coming to her. Often pilgrimage has a sense of timing in terms of our age. For young people, it may be seeking direction, going on pilgrimage to pray to God that you find your way. For the middle-aged, perhaps considering new possibilities. I had one woman that had come into the class. She was a medical doctor. She said she had to go on pilgrimage to Santiago, which she did, which is a long, arduous journey, walking. But because of that experience, she came back and she stopped being a medical doctor and became a pastoral minister, someone who worked in hospital chaplaincy. That was what was so important for her. For newly retired people, perhaps they're preparing for the harvest. I was in France some time ago, and I was going along the road to Santiago. This whole road starts in Paris or at Cannes. It goes down to the north of Spain and then across to the northwestern part. And if I was lost, which my GPS was always losing, it was always off, I would stop with these pilgrims along the way, and they would often know exactly where I should be going. And they were all ages, older, younger, perhaps children along with them. The fourth stage is surrender. Keep it simple. This is something I learned from working with recovering people. Keep it simple. Letting go, letting God. Go with the flow. This was part of the surrender of letting go was these Irish monks. They would often get into a boat and pray to God to take them where they should go. And often, we're told, they were led to Of course, we don't know what happened to those who, the storm decimated. But the whole idea was to let go. Let God take us. The next one is synchronicity. I've told you about that. Friendly guides that come up unexpectedly. Things coming together for our good. Sixth one is ritual. When my son Daniel was leaving, he was about 17. He was going with his friend to California. I didn't like this idea that he'd be traveling not only with this other kid that, I didn't really trust, and that they'd be on their own. This was my son, my younger son. I wanted to protect him. So what I did was call him to a prayer shrine I had, and blessed him, and gave him a chain with a cross on it, and told him to protect himself. Well, Daniel came back, and he was very happy to tell me that chain was really great. Even when he was getting those tattoos, he didn't let the chain get in the way. And so that was nice, I thought. Our pilgrimage, lighting candles. I often do that when I travel. I pray for people along the way. I want to remember them. I was in Vietnam. I forget the name of the city because it's changed under the Vietnamese. Saigon is the one I remember. But anyway, there was a Catholic church still there, and I was lighting candles for one of my family members that I thought could use the prayers. When I was in Bethlehem, the tour guide, the pilgrim guide, said, let's sing some Christmas songs that you remember. And this was the crypt where the site of Jesus' birth is honored. And we sang songs. And I cried, just remembering my early childhood when all the grandchildren, my cousins, gathered together, and we thought about Santa Claus coming. And my uncles would scare us because they pretended to be Santa Claus. But it was that reminder of memory that awakened in me this gratitude for them. When I climbed Mount Sinai and got to the top of a mountain I thought I would never reach nor get back safely. And all I wanted once we got up there was to be quiet, just to be quiet. And there was a group of my other Christians who just wanted to sing hymns. Fine, I wanted quiet. So we split up kind of the two groups. The quiet group, whatever works, I think, is helpful. The seventh of these stages is that of return home, the sharing of stories, the meals of remembrance. Perhaps shrines in our house. I have many shrines in my home. Of the various places I've traveled, that remind me of the saints and the sacred places that I've had the privilege of encountering. So as part of your own questions again, let me ask you this. Where do you desire to go? Where do you want to go? And also the timing. Is it feasible? Sometimes we have to put aside money to be able to afford travel, as you know. But still to clarify what is drawing us, the priorities perhaps, and then going with that. Sometimes people go on pilgrimage to places that seem entirely foreign to their own traditions and upbringing. This was true of Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, who was a spiritual writer, someone I admired terrifically in his writings and his life. I went to Gethsemane, where the community where he lived. I've stayed in his cell. I was given that privilege of spending a day. So I mentioned to people, part of the day was, can I steal something from this hermitage? I mean, there was a book in the library, his library, an Irish book, an Irish monastic book. I'd been looking all over for it. I couldn't find it in any place in Ireland. It was out of print. And there it was, in Thomas Merton's hermitage, right there. And I thought, now who would miss it? And obviously nobody's really taking advantage of that gem. So it's this struggle, and then I decided, no, you can't do it. So I picked up a stone outside the hermitage and brought it home with me as a memento of that day. But Brother Patrick, who was Merton's secretary, picked me up from the day in Merton's hermitage, and I had my briefcase with me. And he looked at it and he said, you know, people are known to have stolen books from his hermitage. I said, really? How disgusting. Yeah, okay. But anyway, Merton is a key figure for me. I visited, when I went to Bangkok, I got a hold of a taxi cab driver that I'd known before, and I said, okay, first thing we're going to do is find where Merton, this monk, died, which he died in Bangkok, outside of Bangkok. Of course, the taxi cab driver looked at me like, you're crazy, but we eventually found him. And got to the site, the hospital where the conference was taking place, where Merton was speaker. And of course, I realized, well, all these people, the nurses, they weren't even born when Merton was there. So how are they going to find it? Finally, I asked them for this cell. There was a word I can't think of it right now, but it was the right word. They said yes, and they led me, or they pointed me and the cab driver in the right direction. And then I got there and it was locked up, locked. And I thought, I came all this way. I told God, I've come all this way and I cannot get in. And then the cab driver said, well, there's a woman here that has a key. Synchronicity again, I thought. So I got in and she gave me the whole spiel of where his body was found after getting out of the shower, electrocution. And I was thrilled to be and to pray on the site where he had died. But Merton, in his last week before his death, went to Sri Lanka, Palanarua, which is a place of these giant Buddhas. And he wrote, when he got there, he had this experience, this awakening experience, which changed his life, even though it was a week before his death. He writes, I don't know when in my life I have ever had such a sense of beauty and spiritual validity running together in one aesthetic illumination. Surely, with Palanarua, my Asian pilgrimage has come clear and purified itself. I mean, I know and have seen what I was obscurely looking for I don't know what else remains, but I have now seen and have pierced through the surface and have got beyond the shadow and the disguise. So this was obviously a man who came from a family that was not believers, to a conversion of his own Catholicism, and then becoming a monk, and then becoming known through his writings of his outreach to all sorts of religious traditions. Here, a week before his death, it seemed like it came as a culmination of his search, this non-verbal but visual experience of seeing this Buddha. So I close with that experience of Merton, and it is the next place I want to go. If I can still walk there and I still can move, I want to go to Sri Lanka and I want to see the Buddha of Merton. And it's a book I'm writing now on his life and how Zen Buddhism changed himself. So I thank you if you're still there. I thank you for being here with this talk, and I wish you well in your sacred travels and your own pilgrimage through life.